Hey everybody, I'm Steve Bourie, author of The American Casino Guide. If you're not familiar with it, please be sure to visit our website at americancasinoguidebook.com. Today I'm going to do an interview with Arnold Snyder. Arnold is a well-known author, expert in the field of blackjack. He's been doing it for like 40 years. I think I've known him about 15, 20 years myself. He's a very interesting guy. He's been on blackjack teams, and he does all these various advanced methods to try and beat the game of blackjack. And about a few months ago, maybe 3-4 months ago, he came out with this new book called Radical Blackjack. And in here, he chronicles stories of what he did, and he puts real names in there of what he did in real places of how he beat the casinos through the years for millions of dollars. And we're going to talk to him about that. It's a long interview. It's about an hour, so I broke it up into two parts. In part one, we're going to talk about his background, how he became an expert on blackjack, what is shuffle tracking, which is very complex, and you got to be a card counter to do it. But then we'll talk about loss rebates, where you don't have to be a card counter, and even low-level players, loss rebates can help you. And then we're going to talk about whole card play, where you can actually, some players, if you get a sloppy dealer, he can show you his whole card, and it's perfectly legal if that happens. And there are players who specialize in that, but he talks about it, and maybe you can find a way to do it. And then we're going to come back in part two. We're going to talk about how he beat internet casinos, and he knew Ken Houston, who was one of the most famous blackjack players of all time. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then part three, we're going to talk about an interesting story where a small casino in Las Vegas changed the rules of blackjack because they thought they'd promote the game and get more players. And they got a lot of players, all right. The place had to shut the game down. They had so many players there because they turned it into a game where the players had an advantage over the casino. And one more thing before we get going here. I want to talk about this book. Arnold had RGE Publishing back in 1999, and he brought this book out. It's called Robbing the One-Armed Bandits. And this was the first book that got into how to get an advantage over slot machines. So all his career, Arnold has been looking for ways to get advantages over casinos. He's a very interesting guy, and I hope you like the interview. And this is going to be part one with Arnold Snyder. We're going to talk about his new book again, Radical Blackjack. Thanks. Arnold Snyder, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Steve. How are you?
I am doing well, thank you. Now, I've met you a couple of times in the past. I think about 15 or 20 years ago, we had the same book distributor, and we spent hours together at one of the book shows. I think it was in Los Angeles. And then a couple of years ago, I got invited to Max Rubin's Blackjack Ball, which we'll talk about later. And I met you there a couple of times. So it's nice to see you again. And today you have a new book out, Radical Blackjack, and we're going to talk about this book. But first, I want to give people a little bit of background information that you are one of the foremost experts on blackjack. You've written at least 8 books on gambling, including Black Belt in Blackjack, which is a classic. You published Blackjack Forum magazine, quarterly magazine dedicated to just blackjack, and you are one of the 7 original inductees to the Blackjack Hall of Fame. But now what's interesting about you is that you didn't start off playing blackjack. You were working in the post office, and you were curious about the game. So could you just give us a little bio about you, how you got started?
Yeah, well, I actually didn't know anything about gambling. I'd never been in a casino, and somebody gave me a copy of Ed Thorpe's Beat the Dealer, which was the first book that really had a card counting system and a method for beating the casinos. I was fascinated by it, and I just kept reading more and more books on the subject. Turned out I had a knack for the mathematics of it, and I put it together into a small book of my own that I titled The Blackjack Formula, and sent it out to the people that were publishing blackjack newsletters and magazines on gambling and stuff. And I got great reviews. And the next thing I knew, I was getting orders for this book. It was selling for $100 a copy, and I just figured, like, what am I working at the post office for, and why am I even going up to Reno to play blackjack for $2 and $5 a hand? I'm making thousands of dollars selling this, a mathematical formula. And
Oh,
so
uh-huh.
technically I became a writer before I became anything close to a professional gambler.
Ah, okay, but now, so you started off betting $2 to $5 a hand in blackjack, and in the book here we have examples where you're putting up $500,000 bankroll. You're depositing it in the casino cage, $500,000 bankroll. So now I read your book, and I'm always fascinated by blackjack, and I subscribed to Blackjack Forum magazine when it was around. I counted cards myself for 3 years, but I never did it to make a living. I just did it for fun to see if it worked. And yes, it did work. Not all the time, but yes, it did work. So now some of the so we're going to talk about what's in the book, and we're going to go a little sort of by chapter. And some of these are techniques where you needed card counting, and some of them you did not need to be a card counter to make them work. But let's start off with shuffle tracking. Can you explain what shuffle tracking is for the people who aren't familiar with it?
Okay, yeah, shuffle tracking was essentially, it was initially the people that were building the first blackjack computers. They started making, in the late 70s, early 80s, they started making concealable computers that a person could strap on under their clothing, and they could use their toes to input information using a kind of a Morse code. And these strap-on computers, they were capable of doing a lot of things that, say, a human blackjack player couldn't do. They could keep track of more information with perfect accuracy. And one of the things they used them for was what they called shuffle tracking. And what that meant was they would record all the cards that went into the shoe in the order they went in. And when the dealer took it apart and then started to riffle the pieces together, they learned to do this with a computer, so that the computer would then riffle the pieces together. They would have to tell the computer, all of this is input with the toes. In fact, the biggest problem that these early computer players had was their feet cramping. The soles of their feet, the muscles there would just start cramping because they're literally typing with their big toes. And a lot of information, and very quickly. So it was a real skill to even try to use one of these things. But the computer could actually then, when the dealer started dealing the next shoe, the computer could actually estimate and predict the cards that were about to come out. Well, this was like way beyond regular card counting. And one of the players I knew back then, his name was Steve Bourie, one of the greatest players of all time. And he had told me that, well, there were actually players that could track shuffles visually and follow slugs of high cards from, from the shuffle, from where it went to where it would arrive at the next shuffle. And that fascinated me, but I didn't have any information on how it was done. And so I started trying to figure that stuff out. And eventually I found a very simple method of doing it. I called it one good slug, where I would literally just watch for when the whole table had tens and aces on it. Sometimes it just happens. Everybody's got 20s and 19s and a couple of blackjacks out there. Well, when the dealer took those and put them into the discard rack, I would just stare at that place until the dealer did the shuffle. And when those cards got shuffled, I'd look at where they went, and then I would wait. And when he got to that point, I would raise my bets, and hallelujah, those cards would come out. And I just thought, this is like way beyond card counting. This is like you actually, these cards are coming out. And suddenly it made the multiple deck games way more attractive to me than the single deck games. The single deck games pretty much are widely considered the easy games to beat for card counters. And that's because for your standard card counting systems, that is true. They are way easier to beat. And it's one of the reasons why the casinos kept adding more and more decks, because it was too easy for players to beat the single deck and the double deck games. But I became attracted to these shoe games. And basically, that's really all shuffle tracking is. I mean, I wrote a book about shuffle tracking that's like 100 and some pages, but essentially it's the ability to watch where when the high cards come out. Just keep your eyes peeled on those cards when they go into the discard stack. And then when the dealer takes the stack and starts breaking it down and shuffling, watch where those cards go. And when they're about to come out in the next shuffle, that's where you bet. That would be the simplest explanation, but it should make sense to people because technically that's the easy way to do it. And it's like a good explanation of how you get your advantage.
Okay, now you were talking about originally shuffle tracking started with people with computers on their bodies, but that was outlawed in what was it, 1987?
Yeah, oh yes, I think 83, 84, something like that.
Right, so you can't do that today. You would go to jail today if you brought a computer in to help you follow the tracking.
Right, that's
okay.
True.
All right, but now in your book, you give examples where you use shuffle tracking playing big bets. You went from one hand of $100 to six hands of $10,000. You went from $100 to $60,000. And it was with your wife, Radar, and you give examples where you played, how much you won, how it turned out. And that was very interesting. So she is the one that does the tracking for you.
Yeah, she had read my the original shuffle tracking descriptions where I wrote about it was in Blackjack form. It was a series, a 3-part series back in the mid-90s, and she had read those, and she became fascinated with it because she was living on the East Coast, and she was working for the United Mine Workers. She was a union person, and she used to go to Atlantic City with the mine workers. She would travel, they'd go, they were just basically going for fun. And she had basically, she just kept seeing them lose their money all the time. So she started looking online, looking for information about blackjack, like, is there some way to beat it? And she found Blackjack Forum, and she found my website, and she started ordering stuff, and she found the shuffle tracking stuff that I wrote. And so she taught herself to shuffle track and started going with the mine workers to see if she could get them to start winning. Now, she herself really didn't have any money to bet, but she would go, not say nothing big. And she found, wow, shuffle tracking really works. And she ended up just saving her money to hit the road and go see. This is all the casinos that were opened in the Indian casinos in Michigan and the Midwest, and the riverboat casinos down south. The country was kind of going crazy on opening casinos in states all over the place. And she, just started traveling around and tracking shuffles. And she, in fact, is a better shuffle tracker than I am. It's a kind of a skill that, you could, like I say, a computer can do it with incredible, absolutely incredible accuracy. But those are now illegal. And it makes sense they made them illegal, because otherwise everybody could just go buy a computer and sit there and, if they can learn to type with their big toes, they could all beat the game of blackjack. But, to do it mentally, it's sort of like there is no perfect way to do it, because you aren't a computer. You can't actually do what a computer does, but you can keep looking for something else. You can keep trying to get it a little better. Maybe try to go for 2 different slugs in there. Maybe try to figure out what are the cards that are being married to my slug. How does that affect it? And what about the cards above it and below it? And, all these different things that have to do with the different ways different dealers shuffle. She just became really good at it. And, like I say, she was better at it than I was. My wife she's a genius. She went to Harvard on a full scholarship in science. And, she never ended up becoming a scientist. She ended up becoming a shuffle tracker. But, she was really good at it. And she was a great partner, because, I was able to say sit there and I could drink and you know, schmooze with the boss and the dealers and flirt with the cocktail waitresses. She was doing all the mental work, and under the table she was, you know, knocking me in the knee with her knuckles to tell me what to do, how much to bet, you know, how many hands to play. She was literally doing all the work, and I was just I was the big player. I was just the jerk that they were actually wondering about, and I was just there to put on an act and do what she said. And
that's part of the stuff. I'm sorry, that's part of the stuff that you mentioned in the book, where you go together, and part of it is an act to make the casino think that you're just an average gambler. And she was giving you advice how to play your hands, because, well, normally as a card counter, there are certain signs that a casino will look out for, especially. No, a card counter normally wouldn't make a big bet when the freshly shuffled deck comes out. They're going to put a standard bet and raise their bets as the count gets better. But with shuffle tracking, it's different, because you may have that slug of good cards right at the beginning, and you do give examples in the book where that happens, and you're making big bets right off the top of a new deck, which a card counter wouldn't do.
Yeah, and in fact, once you're playing at, say, really big stakes, the casino will reserve a table for you. And that's just the perfect situation for a shuffle tracker, because essentially you are always going to cut the best cards to the top. So you're always going to come out right off the top with your big bets. That is the exact opposite of any way that a card counter would play. A card counter has to sit there and keep counting until the deck, you know, the shoe gets positive, you know, enough low cards have come out, the count is now high enough, they can start putting the money out. Whereas a shuffle tracker does not look at all like a card counter. And that actually puts the casinos very much at ease. You know, somebody sits down and they're just betting table limit right off the top. The dealer just put the cards in the shoe. They're like, well, obviously he's not a card counter. So, you know, he's safe. He's just a gambler. And so this is why we got away with these monstrously huge betting spreads. I mean, I don't think there's any card, you know, like the big casinos in Vegas at that time, MGM, Caesars, Paris, a lot of the same casinos that are there right now and that are the big casinos. Well, they generally had on their high limit tables, they often had $100 minimum and a $10,000 maximum. Well, there isn't any card counter that would actually try to spread from a hand of 100 to a hand of 10,000. Whereas I was actually allowed to spread. I would ask for permission to spread to all the hands on the table, and they would give it to me. They would, you know, yeah, sure. And I would literally spreading my bets from one hand of 100 up to 6 hands of 10,000 each, and totally based on shuffle tracking. And they never were able to figure it out, because I was coming off the top of the decks big. There was just nothing for them to look for. This is why I always thought this shuffle tracking is like, this is the best blackjack play that exists. You don't look like a card counter. The casinos let you get away with murder. And, you know, but, you know, that's like one of the other reasons is I felt like, you know, if you just keep this up, they're not going to ever figure out what you're doing. They don't have, you know, they don't think in terms of shuffle tracking, that like you know what's going to come before the cards are dealt. That's beyond their comprehension.
Okay, so now that shuffle tracking, that's a very advanced method. Not everyone can use it, and you'd have to be a card counter to use it also. But now let's move on to loss rebates. Loss rebates, a lot of people aren't familiar with loss rebates. That's where a casino will say, let's say you, well, you give an example, if you lost, and it was, I think MGM Grand, you had to put up, if you lost $250,000, they would rebate to you 10% of your losses. And some casinos will do this for high rollers, but there are also other casinos who, you mentioned Silver Sevens, I think it was, which used to be what, Terribles? where they
Yeah,
would
yeah.
rebate you.
Terribles started this, and then they became Super Sevens or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they had a 10% loss rebate on anybody that lost $1,000. If you
Mm-hmm.
lost $1,000, they'd give you back 100. And they had, and this, now this is a small casino. This isn't like MGM. They had, I think their table limit was 500. I think their limits on their tables were something like 5 to 500 or something like that. But anybody that lost $1,000, they'd give you back 100. And it was actually, say for say a card counter, just a regular card counter. The rules of the game weren't very good, but the loss rebate itself made the game favorable for a card counter who could actually just use a small betting spread. Normally, these were 6-deck games and not a good set of rules. A dealer hits off 17, and I don't think they allowed doubling after splitting. A lot of the favorable rules weren't there, but that loss rebate, and I really think most players didn't even know that rebate had in itself had a real advantage to it. But like now, I never played that game. That game came out, years after I had quit shuffle tracking and quit playing blackjack at high level. But it was, it was available for years, and then Silver Sevens took it over. Now their version of the loss rebate is not anywhere near as good as the Terribles version. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't advise people to run out and play at Silver Sevens because they have a loss rebate. I think now it's a 7% rebate on a loss of $1,700, and they pay you in what they call casino chip. It's not regular chips and it's not regular money. It's these bonus chips they have, promo chips, people call them sometimes. They have about half the value. The reason is if you bet one of those chips and you win, they take the chip away, but they give you the win. If you bet one of those chips and lose, you lose it. So it's sort of like with a normal chip, if you bet and you win, you get to keep the chip and bet it again. This, they take it away. So the chips have only about half the value. So their 7% rebate really comes down to like a 3.5% rebate or something like that. And Terribles was 10%. So it's just not as good as it used to be. But there are opportunities for loss rebates in casinos. A lot of video poker promotions have loss rebates, and in fact, I'm sure there are a lot of professional video poker players out there that are taking advantage of loss rebates. A lot of the money they make has to do with players club deals and bonuses and things like that. Which is pretty much kind of like what the loss rebates are. They're kind of like a bonus from the casino, and the casinos are not very good at figuring out how much these are worth, and smart players can exploit those things.
Right. Now, in the book, you give examples. It's like this one we're talking about, Silver Sevens or Terribles previously in Las Vegas for lower rollers. But you were participating in some, and you give examples. You give stories how you and Radar went in, and what was interesting to me was one, you put $500,000 in that. It wasn't you, but you had someone backing you.
Right. I had an investor. Yeah.
Right. So that's always good because it's not your money.
Right. Yeah, it was a sweet deal.
But it was interesting. I thought one of the most interesting things was you put up $500,000 at the MGM Grand at the Cage before you played, and they wouldn't let you stay in the mansion, which was their suite for high rollers.
Yeah, MGM had a, I don't know if they still have it. They probably do. I'm sure they still have the place. They used to call it the Mansion. I don't know if they still do, but it was a place where celebrities who sometimes they'd be appearing in the showrooms, or sometimes they would just be celebrities coming to town. They'd want to stay at MGM. They'd put them up in the Mansion. It was a separate like hotel room, and all the rooms had butlers. You know, and this is where, say, their Asian high rollers would come in with their, you know, and that some of these guys would come in with multi-million-dollar bankrolls, and they want to play baccarat at $100,000 a hand. Well, they put those guys up in the mansion. Whereas me, you know, putting up $500,000, I didn't really rate the mansion yet. So, you know, I was like, I was a big player, you know, but I wasn't what they called a whale. You know, a whale was like you know, he got everything he wanted, and had a separate hotel to stay in with a butler in his room, and, you know, there to press his trousers before he goes out in the morning. You know, we did end up staying in the mansion once. And again, I think because the amount of action I was putting on their tables was really big, and so they put us up in the mansion. And the last thing I want is a butler. I don't want some guy hanging around in my kitchen to cook, to heat my coffee. You know, it's like I'm not the type that enjoys that kind of pampering. You know, but we did manage to stay there once.
All right. Well, you have those. Again, in the book, you have examples of lost rebate plays at a very high level, but also you give some advice for lower limit players. Now, let's move on. You had a chapter in there on hole card play. Now, hole card play is, for people who aren't familiar with it, it's sometimes the dealer will accidentally expose their card. And years ago, it used to be easier because the dealer would have to, you know, if you had a 10 or an ace up, you'd have to look underneath, and they would bend the corners, but now they have those little mirror systems, so the dealers aren't bending the cards anymore. So what can you tell us about hole card play, which is legal, as you point out in the book?
Yeah, it is legal. There was a court case that came up, and again, this is back in the 80s. And two players were accused. They accused them. There was one player on the first base side of the table, another player on the third base side of the table. And the guy over on the third base side of the table, he was the big bettor. I think he was betting $500, $600, $700, something like that. The guy over on the first base side, he was just sitting there betting a nickel. Well, and this is the thing with hole card play. Well, first of all, the method they were using is an impossible method now, because, like you say, the dealers don't peek at their hole cards the way they used to by bending a corner up. And what hole card players used to look for, they would look for a dealer who would bend the corner up so that if there's a guy sitting way over on the first base side, that when he picked that corner up, he was too sloppy to hide it from the first base side of the table. This is why they would put the big money player over on the third base side, because that's the guy that the dealer would be afraid of. And so the guy sitting on first base, he would see the hole card, and would signal the guy on third base who's betting the money how much to bet, how to play his hands. And anyway, these two players were busted for this, and in the court, the judge found them innocent, and he said, you know, it's the job of the dealer to hide the hole card. It's not the job of the player to not look for it. You know, if a player can see it, it's just because it's the dealer's fault, and that's ultimately the casino's fault. You didn't train your dealer. You have an untrained, dealer on the game, and so that in itself, right there, made hole card play legal, and it also legalized the fact what they were doing, which was they were actually a two-player team. They were using signals, and so all of that didn't make any difference. From the court's perspective, it didn't matter if they were a team and the house didn't know that. You know, players who know each other are allowed to play on the same table when they don't have to tell the house that they know each other. They're allowed to talk. They're allowed to communicate. So if they're using secret communicate, what's it matter? You know, the important thing is the house has the job of hiding the hole card. Well, you can't use that method anymore because dealers don't peek that way. So now the more common method of hole card play is there's dealers who they do what they call, they front load the card, meaning when they put the whole card underneath the up card, they tip it up slightly to the front and push it and put it under. And whole card players were simply players that found dealers who were sloppy about tipping that card up, and it would just be a very quick flash, and most people would never know it. But it was the type of thing that, say players that were short, who were sitting lower down to the table height, were able to see it. And again, it's the type of play where if you know the dealer's whole card, you don't have to count cards. If you know what the dealer's got, you know how to play your hand. And the whole skill then is disguising the fact that you know what the dealer had. In other words, you have a 17 and you're sitting there and you know the dealer has an 18, you don't take a hit. You can't take a hit because they're going to come on to you very quickly if you're playing that accurately. So you have to try to play looking like a normal player, but you can make really good decisions on, let's say you have a 15 and the dealer has a 16. Well, okay, obviously you're not going to take a hit. Let's say the dealer's got a 20. You're going to take a hit. In other words, it's things where you have these stiff hands where you can kind of play either way, but you just can't take full advantage of all the whole card information if it makes you look too smart to be doing what you're doing.
Right. Now, in the book, you give examples of some players who specialize in whole card play. And before we move on to the next one, I wanted to ask you, I think you mentioned didn't one guy sit in a wheelchair so he could be real low to the table?
There was a player who actually used to go to the casinos in a wheelchair. They always thought he was a paraplegic. And I mean, I heard funny stories about him. I didn't put this one in the book. And I don't know if it's true, but there was a story I heard. It was either at the, I can't remember, it was the Stardust or the Stratosphere. I think it was the Stratosphere. I heard he arrived in his wheelchair. Well, he had already been discovered at other casinos as a whole card player, but he hadn't ever been discovered at this casino. And again, this is decades ago. But there was a pit boss or a new boss in one casino who he recognized and who he knew that he was a whole card player. And he was sitting there in his wheelchair, and the guy looked at him and immediately went to the phone, and he realized that they were calling security. He just pushed back from the table, stood up, and went running out of the casino, leaving his wheelchair there. And the table full of players going, what? The guy in the wheelchair just stood up and ran out. Now, whether or not that's a true story, I don't know. I mean, again, I didn't put that one in the book. I never talked to the guy to verify did that really happen. But yeah, there was a player. There probably were more than one player that tried methods like that for getting down low to the table height.
Okay, so that's another example of where someone could get an advantage playing in blackjack without being a card counter. Okay, all right, Arnold Snyder, it was great to see you. I haven't seen you in a long time. It was great sitting here chatting with you. And again, the book, Radical Blackjack, look for it on Amazon or huntingtonpress.com or lasvegasadvisor.com. Arnold, it's great seeing you again. Thanks very much and take care.
Okay, good seeing you, Steve.
Thanks. Okay, that was the end of part one of our interview with Arnold Snyder, author of the new Blackjack book, just came out a few months ago, Radical Blackjack, where he tells how he made millions of dollars playing in the casinos. Don't forget, we're going to come back with part two. In part two, we're going to go over how he beat internet casinos and his advice for how it might still be able to be done. And then we're going to talk about Ken Houston. Ken Houston was one of the most famous blackjack players in the history of the game. And Arnold knew Ken, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then the final part, we're going to talk a little bit about Blackjack Forum magazine, which he put out for many years. It was a quarterly magazine devoted strictly to blackjack, great articles in there. And my favorite article was Surprise Party at the Klondike, where the rules of the game were changed by one of the casino managers. He thought he'd get some more interest in the game, and he got a lot more interest because the place was packed with advantaged gamblers betting maximum bets on the table. It's a great story. So hope you come back for part 2. Thanks very much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe. Push that subscribe button. Thanks again, and best wishes for good luck in the casinos.